Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Shirato, and I'm going to be talking about the organization Kiss the Ground. So for my presentation, I'm going to start by talking about the organization and then their claims, and then third-party scientific evidence and counter arguments to the organization's claims, and then conclusion. So Kiss the Ground is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in California. They were founded in 2013 by Ryland Engelhard and Finian Makepeace, and they were inspired by the teachings of Graham Sate, and I'm going to come back to him in a little bit. They have 100% or 4 stars on Charity Navigator, and their mission is to awaken people to the possibilities of regeneration, a solution for the wellness, water, and climate crisis. They have a 3-pronged approach. They do storytelling, education, and advocacy. So their storytelling part of what they do is they make videos. Their main pieces of media are 2 full-length documentaries called Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, and they're both available to watch on Amazon Prime. They also make mini documentaries and post them on YouTube and have blog posts on their website about different individual farmers and their lived experiences. They also are focused on education for the public and for farmers who would like to practice the practices that they talk about. They provide courses for farmers. They have public speakers. They also have free resources and brand packages that you can buy. And the advocacy arm of their organization is focused on Regenerate America, which is a coalition of farmers, nonprofit organizations, for-profit businesses, and individuals. And they campaign for policy change related to regenerative agriculture. Some of these acts are the Conservation Practices Act and the Soil Care Act. And then another thing that they do that they just started in November 2014 that wasn't included in any of these 3 arms is that they just started a direct-to-farmer grant program. So I thought it would be worthwhile to look into this guy, Graham Sate, who inspired the founders of the organization. He has written hundreds of articles and at least 1 book on regenerative agriculture, human and plant health and wellness, and soil science. And he runs the for-profit business Nutritech Solutions. It trains farmers in regenerative practices, and they also sell products. And he has worked with some of the largest food suppliers in Australia and Vietnam and some in India. So I just thought it would be worthwhile to keep in mind that some of the proponents of these practices have something to gain from them. So now this takes me to part 2, which is Kiss the Ground's claims. So as I mentioned before, their main pieces of media are Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, which are full-length documentaries that you can watch on Amazon Prime. So the main argument in Kiss the Ground is for regenerative agriculture, the definition of which is a systems-based holistic look at the land being stewarded and application of various principles with the goal of making the land more productive and biodiverse over time. And that's a really vague definition, but on their website, they list the 6 key principles of regenerative agriculture, which are least disturbance, living root, soil armor, increased biodiversity, animal integration, and context. Regenerative agriculture is part of the suite of soil-based carbon capture solutions. These are some of the ones that are mentioned in the documentary. They don't go over all of these, but some of them are managed grazing, a plant-rich diet, composting, etc. The purpose of regenerative agriculture is biosequestration, which is fixing atmospheric carbon into the soil. Here's another definition. The biologic carbon sequestration is a natural ability of life in ecosystems to store carbon. So through the photosynthesis process, plants absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and some of it goes down into the roots, which is also augmented by microorganisms in the soil. And this should fix the carbon into the soil and take it out of the atmosphere. And here's a little clip from the Kiss the Ground documentary.
The soil environment can hold more carbon than the atmosphere and plants living on the surface of the soil combined. Plants use sunlight as energy and they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They turn it into a carbon fuel, and that's how they grow. But 40% of that carbon fuel they send down to their roots. They're leaking it out in a very strategic way to soil microorganisms. Plants are feeding soil microorganisms carbon, and the soil microorganisms are bringing plants mineral nutrients. And in the process of all that, those soil microorganisms make a carbon glue out of that carbon fuel. And they make habitat in the soil. They make little pockets in the soil to control the flow of air and water. And that's one of the ways that carbon gets fixed in the soil.
So Kiss the Ground frames regenerative agriculture as the answer to all of our climate problems. They claim that it can reverse global warming, increase biodiversity, reverse desertification, and more. And two of the main concepts for how this happens are drawdown and legacy load. So drawdown is when atmospheric CO2 is a net negative, reducing atmospheric carbon. And the important thing to note here is that it's not just zero emissions. This chart here shows how temperatures, global temperatures, and atmospheric carbon have increased over time. And if we had zero emissions right now for the rest of time, it would still just be a straight line from where it is right now, which is not what drawdown is. Drawdown would be not just staying the same, but overall reducing the carbon in the atmosphere and therefore the global temperature. So it is not sustainability or zero emissions, but this concept of regeneration, which goes beyond sustainability.
Since 1750, when the Industrial Revolution began, we've pumped about 1,000 billion tons, also known as gigatons, of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's called our legacy load of carbon. And even if we stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, that legacy load of carbon will still be there.
That legacy load of carbon dioxide is still going to be warming the atmosphere for decades, if not centuries.
So that legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere is why we need drawdown, because there's already this extra CO2 in the atmosphere that we need to get rid of somehow. And the next concept is desertification. And the definition of that is the process of fertile land becoming desert. And a quote from the documentary is when soil turns to dirt. So according to Kiss the Ground, about 1/3 of the earth is in the process of desertifying, and over 1 billion people are predicted to become refugees as a result of this process. And according to the UN, the world's remaining topsoil will be gone in 60 years. And so the process of desertification is affected by our agricultural practices. And so 40% of rain comes from land water cycles, of which plants are a significant part. So if we have large areas of bare ground, that disrupts that water cycle and therefore microclimates, and then large areas of bare ground and disrupted microclimates disrupt larger macroclimates, which affects global warming. And a quote from the film is, "A covered planet is a healthy planet." Related to that is the some of the main ideas of regenerative agriculture, which is to have ground cover at all times. And this is a clip from the documentary that shows an illustration of atmospheric CO2 and how it changes annually by the months.
This is a supercomputer model by NASA. We're concerned of the red and purples being CO2. I want you to notice the dates. That is February, March. Now, what are we doing March, April? What do we do in modern agriculture in April? We are tilling. We're tilling the land. And look at the huge plumes of CO2. Look at the dates. May. Now, let's see what happens around June. Look at the colors change. Ladies and gentlemen, what is happening in June? You see how powerful the living plants are? Can you imagine if we had all our rangeland and all our cropland covered? A covered planet is a healthy planet. We can fix a lot of our climate issues to bring the CO2 down into a living plant and put it back into the soil where it belongs.
So I thought that was a good illustration of what the effects of growing plants can have on atmospheric CO2. So the 4 practices of regenerative agriculture are no-till, cover crops, perennials and trees, and compost/mob grazing. And these are all interrelated. So the concept of no-till is not breaking up the ground. Tilling is when the soil is disrupted by plowing. And the argument is that no-till results in more plant growth, more rainfall, better water and mineral retention in the soil, and more. So here's a little clip about that.
Rain falls on this, it's going to go right into the soil. Rain falls on bare soil, it's going to run off, and it's going to evaporate quickly.
Soil that is not tilled stores more water, thus increasing microbe growth, which leads to more plant growth and even to more local rainfall. This is the virtuous cycle of regeneration.
So the next part of regenerative agriculture is cover crops, and that is closely related to perennials and trees. So the idea of cover crops is that there's living root at all times in the soil. Um, and they also advocate for planting a variety and diversity of crops. And this is also related to the idea that grasses are a really good way to get the benefits of what we've been talking about. They talk about in the documentary that grasses are more important than trees in about 2/3 of the world where there's not enough water for trees to grow. And then the final part is compost/mob grazing. So they talk about how animals like cattle should be grazed on the land, and they should be grazing living plants. And they should do this in a controlled way instead of separating the animals and where they're fed from where the feed is grown, which is the way it's generally done in the US currently, is to have the corn or whatever the cows are being fed is grown in a separate area from where the cattle are grazing. And they also talk about how the hooves, dung, and urine of the animals can actually cause grass to grow and increase the growth of the grasses. And then another thing that they talked about a lot, but wasn't in the 4 practices of regenerative agriculture, is the idea of having no additives um, or inputs into the soil and the plants. So the idea is that there would be no synthetic or unnatural fertilizer, herbicides, or pesticides used. And those chemicals have harmful environmental effects, such as increased CO2 emissions, and they harm native ecosystems, and they decrease biodiversity. They also become less effective over time, and they are expensive, which brings me to my next point, which is that they argue that there are lots of benefits for farmers for um, going in a more regenerative direction. So they can do that by saving money on inputs, as I just mentioned, or um, they also argue that the crops are more resilient to weather changes and climate disasters like drought and hail and storms and things like that. And it can also increase their income through diversification by planting different kinds of crops at different times of the year or in different areas. And here's a little clip about the possible benefits for farmers.
Even with genetically altered seeds, chemical sprays, and government subsidies, most farmers struggle to make a few dollars per acre. But on its 5,000 acres, Brown's Ranch generates over $100 profit per acre per year.
If you build a healthy farm ecosystem, you're going to be resilient. You're going to take the risk out of it. Once a farmer starts to manage for soil health,
Here's another clip talking about the possible benefits.
once a farmer starts to manage for soil health and see those economic benefits, they won't turn back.
By switching to regenerative agriculture, American farmers could increase their profits by over $100 billion annually and virtually eliminate their subsidies.
The next thing I'm going to talk about that they mention is the main challenge to regenerative agriculture becoming the new way things are done in this country and the world is politics. One of the main roadblocks in America is the subsidies. So the American government pays farmers to produce certain crops a certain way, which is incongruent with regenerative practices. And in the documentary, they talk about in the 2000s, there was an agreement in Paris that a bunch of countries in the world signed where they pledged that they would use regenerative agricultural practices. But interestingly, the US, China, and India did not sign this agreement. And they, as you can see here, are the three biggest emitters of CO2 in the world. So here's a little clip about the politics.
The federal farm program we have today is the most detrimental thing there is to regenerative agriculture.
In order for our governments to support the shift to regeneration, the people may have to lead the way.
Okay, so this brings me to the third part of my presentation, which is the science behind their claims and some counter arguments. So first, I would like to talk about the term regenerative agriculture. There is no agreed upon definition for this term. Out in the world, different groups use it to mean different things. And some related terms are sustainable intensification, agroecology, climate smart agriculture, and food sovereignty. There's some disagreement in the scientific community for whether it should have a set definition. Some argue that because of its emergent nature, the term should have room for different interpretations in different social and ecological contexts and should allow for consistent improvement, which they argue would not really be possible if the term regenerative agriculture was clearly defined. Another argument is that it's just a buzzword, and there are certain positive and negative aspects of buzzwords. And so here's a definition. 1, they are context specific. 2, have meaning that is ambiguous across different groups. 3, allow interpretive flexibility, but 4, people using the buzzword feel like they know what it means. 5, demonstrate strong beliefs. 6, reflect public discourse on the topic. And 7, have a directing or energizing quality. And so all of these apply to the term regenerative agriculture. But one of the most important aspects, in my opinion, is that the fact that it's a buzzword reflects the public discourse and the public thinking on the subject. So another concern is that the term is used for greenwashing. In a survey of farmers, some expressed that the term has been co-opted by large corporations who are using it for marketing purposes. So when they really shouldn't be using it. Some also argue that the term ignores the historical contributions of Black, Brown, and Indigenous knowledge to the practices, and some fear that widespread use of the term especially by large corporations, could lead to dilution of the meaning. And in that same survey, some participants expressed concern that people using the term are making claims that cannot be backed up by science. So another aspect of the term and how it's being used is that it has ties to social justice. As I mentioned earlier, the contributions of marginalized groups such as Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are central to the ideas of regenerative agriculture. And one quote from the survey is, "The biggest value is community. It is a lifting up and demanding improvement for all communities." So that the idea of community and that this is a participative thing is especially relevant to this class. And also related to that is that it is a producer-led movement rather than top-down researcher-led. But I would also like to note that it is still based on empirical evidence, but it also uses participatory research in which stakeholders are involved in the whole research process. So another argument is that the tendency to make a business case for regenerative agriculture should be regarded cautiously, as this approach can veil the motivations of different actors and sidestep more fundamental questions about the role of industrial development in environmental degradation and social inequities. So, in other words, it's important to keep in mind the bias that some might have interest in using these regenerative agricultural practices, and that these practices aren't universally equally available to all, depending on the context. So I also wanted to talk about the science that may or may not back up the claims that Kiss the Ground makes. So according to my research, carbon sequestration in soil through these practices is not indefinite. So here's a quote. "A critical consideration is that soil carbon sequestration will not continue indefinitely. Indeed, the sequestered carbon could still be lost at any point, and regenerative agriculture projections need to be clear that increasing soil carbon levels alone is not the key goal, but rather than increasing sorbent carbon levels to the point of equilibrium, and then maintaining the levels is the key to realizing impacts. It's not like there's an infinite amount of CO2 that can be stored in the soil. And another fact is that it's not a permanent solution. It's not permanent that this CO2 stays in the soil forever. Here's another quote. In other words, this quote just means that there are different kinds of carbon that can be sequestered in the soil at different rates, and that some of it is released back into the air after the plants die and are and decompose. So another concept is resiliency. So in Kiss the Ground, they claim that regenerative farms are more resilient to extreme weather events by maintaining soil aggregate stability, lowering bulk density, improving water infiltration and water holding capacity, and reducing erosion and nutrient loss. However, there have been conflicting results in studies on yield stability of no-till crops compared to conventionally tilled crops. More research is needed to really determine the positive effects of no-till. Local context. And Kiss the Ground makes it seem like these regenerative practices are appropriate for everyone, everywhere, at all times. But Ray Berger argues that certain areas are more appropriate for these practices and will see more success. For example, in general, soils that have been the most degraded from historical land use and management practices hold the most potential for increased adoption of regenerative agriculture practices, while other soils may be closer to equilibrium. So there are some areas where this would work better than in others. Furthermore, regions with high temperatures experience enhanced decomposition, and inorganic and peat soils' carbon content mostly will not increase. The aim can only be to maintain the existing carbon levels. That means that the positive effects that Kiss the Ground claims are not always able to be realized depending on the context of the area that they are used in. And studies showed that North America had the highest potential for total carbon storage, followed by South Asia and Europe, which is consistent with the apparent increased potential for historically highly cultivated croplands. On a country basis, the US, India, China, and Russia have the most potential. And I would just like to point out that the US, India, and China were the countries that did not sign the Paris Pledge and are also the three biggest contributors of CO2. And those are also the places where these regenerative practices would be most would have the most potential for success. And also many of the soils which are most degraded can coexist with smallholders who are most marginalized, where the adoption of labor-intensive or land-extensive regenerative agriculture practices may be most challenging from a social and economic perspective. So in other words, as I mentioned earlier, it's not always economically or socially available for people, especially small farmers to and marginalized groups to adopt these practices, especially because they're labor intensive and also require a lot of land. So I also found another article that mentioned some other counter arguments to their claims. One is that it is impossible or nearly impossible to measure the impacts of these practices on atmospheric CO2 or global warming. And it is also really difficult to measure the CO2 concentration in soil and whether that is affected by these practices. And some argue that the no-till practice has some negative effects. For example, captured CO2 can stay in the upper layers of soil, and then when the plants decompose, it is released back into the air instead of being mixed into deeper layers of soil, which can happen when the soil is tilled. Furthermore, research has shown that practices like no-till and cover cropping have to be implemented for at least 6 consecutive years in order to see significant results. And other research has shown that no-till has no significant benefit at all. So there's not really a consensus on how beneficial some of these practices are. Another aspect is that cover crops don't always work depending on the area that you're in because of the growing seasons. For example, in the Midwest where it gets cold in the fall and winter, there's too short of a growing season to germinate and grow cover crops in the off season. Another argument is that Kiss the Ground's argument doesn't account for other greenhouse gases, um, especially ones that microbes in the soil can generate in larger quantities. And the next thing that I would like to talk about is bias. So there are some people that stand to make money off of the adoption of these practices, and some of these proponents make an income off of selling courses or books to farmers that promote practices that are not evidence-based. And one example of this is um, specific fungal to bacterial ratios, composting tea, and using microscopes to identify soil microorganisms, which none of these have been shown to actually have any positive benefit. So finally, in conclusion, Kiss the Ground is a nonprofit organization that works to educate, advocate, and raise awareness around regenerative agriculture and its potential to change climate-related issues. The concept of regenerative agriculture is complex, though, and intertwined with politics and policy, community, marginalized groups, economy, availability of water, and more. Kiss the Ground proposes a solution, but it is overly simplified and presented as a win-win solution that could work anywhere. However, this is not the case, and in reality, it is affected by local contexts. Their argument is backed by empirical evidence, but it lacks nuance and recognition of those who stand to gain from the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices and how implementations may change based on contextual factors. In my opinion, Kiss the Ground should connect visitors of their site to more resources other than their own course, and they should have links to peer-reviewed articles and evidence-based books so that people who want to start using these practices on their own farms can have access to reliable evidence-based information. And another thing that I wanted to note is that further research is needed to fully support the claims of this organization. But overall, I do think that regenerative agricultural practices seem to have a net positive effect